And the leaves are very spiky and pointy. And the bark on the gum tree is kind of rough and spiky like. Well, it's in the same family as the witch hazel, and it's not just the gumball, it's the leaves, it's the bark, the inner bark we're speaking of, which is called the cambium, and it's the sap of this tree, which is very beneficial medicinally. But it's not the only spiked thing that's medicinal. Star anise. Has anybody ever used star anise in here? I've used anise. I don't know if I've used star anise.
I don't know if it's star, but I use it.
You use the anise? Okay. It has kind of a sweet, licoricey flavor.
Color. It gives a color.
Yeah, it gives color. Okay. Star anise is actually the star of the Shikimic show. And that's introducing a little trick word there. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. Pine needles. Pine needles are pokey. Have you ever poked the end of a pine needle? It's kind of sharp, isn't it? It's pokey. And how they are on the leaf, the stem, they're kind of pokey and spiked shape, right? What about fennel? Fennel seeds, these are fennel seeds here on the right. You can kind of see that they're sort of spiky. If you took a cross section of that, it would sort of look like a star, wouldn't it? Kind of spiky. And fennel seeds, you can see how they grow. Kind of spiky, right? Spiked. Look at this. Dandelion. Its leaves are spiked, its flowers are spiked, and even the seed pods are spiked. That's interesting, isn't it? Do we hear anything about other spiked things these days?
Spike protein.
Of course, this spiked thing that I'm referring to today, and because I am recording this to put on our YouTube channel, I'm going to be very careful what I say because I don't want to get this kicked off of YouTube. But it's all the spike stuff in regards to this particular spike thing is scientific conjecture because nobody's ever really seen it. Nobody has ever seen a virus. So it's all scientific conjecture, okay? However, we'll just take it as though it's a real thing. And so I want to share with you some things about spiked things today, okay? One of the key biological characteristics of this other spiked thing that you can see up here, as well as several other viruses, is the presence of spike proteins that allow these viruses to penetrate host cells. So it's those spiky things that are causing the problem. So in this spiked virus that came around in 2019, this thing can cause severe inflammation, which can trigger clotting in our system. So that's what's actually killing a lot of people these days. Is you've heard of blood clots in the lungs, you've heard of stroke, you've heard of heart issues, you've heard of people losing their limbs because of blood clots. Well, that has to do with this inflammation which triggers the clotting system in our body. I could go into that a little bit more, but that's not the purpose necessarily. But what in the world does that have to do with these spiked things? Well, nature is very intuitive, very intelligent. And these spiked things contain two substances that we're going to talk about today. Suramin is one, and the other is, remember that trick word I introduced there with the star anise, Shikimic acid. So we're going to talk a little bit about suramin and Shikimic acid today. Suramin provides a potential antidote for those affected by that spike protein contagion. And if you read on down, and I give the references here, and if anybody wants these slides, just contact me. I'll turn it into a PDF and send it to you. Suramin also showed inhibitory effects against components of the coagulation cascade. Suramin is a component, a suramin-like compound. Suramin is actually a medication that scientists synthesize. But there are suramin-like components in these spiked plants that we're talking about. So this suramin-like component in these plants that we're talking about is very powerful to inhibit this blood clotting cycle that happens because of that other spiked thing that we're talking about. Suramin is actually an extract of pine needle oil. It's a sermon-like component is an extract of pine needle oil. And pine needles, by the way, contain 5 times more vitamin C than lemons. And everybody thinks about citrus fruit because of all of the vitamin C in it. But if you really want a massive dose of vitamin C, make yourself some pine needle tea. And the most effective way to extract not just the vitamin C, but all of the other helpful components, such as the sermon and the shikimic acid, is a simple hot water decoction. Just make a tea. Bring a pot of water to boil, put in your pine leaves, and I usually use, a handful, kind of like this, a big wad of leaves, and just throw it in the water, put the lid on, and turn the heat off, and let it steep for a little bit. I have a question in the back. Yes?
There are various types of pine needle, which is...
Okay, I didn't understand you. I'm sorry.
There are various types of...
Various types of pine needle. That's a good question. And I'm going to answer it very generally for right now. As a general rule, most pines are safe, but there are some in the evergreen family. Now, some people consider the Pacific yew a pine, but it's really not a pine. That one is actually toxic. You shouldn't use that one for this tea that we're talking about. Although it's toxic, it is medicinal, but you have to know what you're doing. It's actually used, I forget what's, it's the yew tips that they make I forget what they call it, but it's an anti-cancer, you can make a tincture out of them and use them for cancer, but you really have to know what you're doing. I'll just go into it a little bit more, but the problem with the pine needles is that they have found that pregnant cows who eat pine needles actually tend to abort their calves. And so it's not necessarily recommended that pregnant ladies would use the pine needle tea, although it's not necessarily been shown to be a problem. It's not recommended. So I have used needles from the Virginia pine, the loblolly, and all different kinds of pines, and I'm still here. I haven't had any problems. So, I think that really is kind of a little bit overblown because of the cows, but we're not cows. I just would use a caution for pregnant ladies. And I'll just show you this also. For pine needle tea, these are some of the effects of pine needle tea, and you can see it's quite effective. And it's actually sort of a refreshing tea. It's not nasty tasting. It's very refreshing. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the shikimic acid. Again, the shikimic acid has anti-platelet aggregation activity and strong antiviral effects. And this is speaking specifically of the pine needle. Pine needles contain both of these, sermon and shikimic acid. And both of these have an effect against the blood clotting and are also antiviral. Okay. Here's another slide. These are just different studies, and I give the references there. The pine needles may be incredibly useful for halting blood clots and defending people from respiratory infections. So I think this is something that we need to consider adding to our medicine cabinet, if you will. Shikimic acid is an active metabolite of polyphenol-rich food intake and could play an important role in reducing platelet activation, aggregation-related thrombus formation, and biomarkers of thrombogenesis in sedentary individuals. This basically just is an encouragement for us to get out and walk, because the more we sit, the more prone we are to do what? Develop blood clots, right? So the more active we are, along with the use of these things which contain this shikimic acid, we have less of a likelihood of developing these blood clots. Star anise has the highest plant content of shikimic acid. So I just bought a pound of these star anise, and I'm going to be making a tincture from this. Now, back to the gumballs that we started talking about in the beginning. The sap, the leaves, the bark, and the seeds, and it's particularly that green seed that is the highest in Shikimic Acid, and they use this Shikimic Acid to make this Tamiflu drug. It's the basis of Tamiflu. So I don't know about you, but it's kind of like, I forget who it was. He was a philosopher or something. He was asked by a skeptic who believed in eating meat, how do you get strong? You have to eat meat. How can you be strong? All the while, the man was plowing behind 2 powerful oxen. And the guy just looked at him and said, how are they strong? They eat plants, you know. So why would I go and get the drug when I can go and get the thing that it's made from in nature with no side effects and have the same effect? So we have a choice. And there's something also, you see the writing up there. I'm not going to say it because I don't want to get booted off of YouTube, but I'm just going to read this. The upshot of all this is that a possible cure for this spiky virus, or at least a defense against its shedding or transmission, appears to already be provided by Mother Nature and is readily available across multiple continents. Pine trees grow all over the world, and we can utilize this. It only takes a handful, 3 cups of this a day, and I believe it would go a long way. Now let's go back around to the dandelion. Has anybody heard anything about ACE2 receptors lately when we're talking about this other spiky thing that we're talking about? There's an ACE2 receptor that is causing problems with this other spiky protein on this other thing that we're talking about, which I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. Dandelions block that. Dandelions prevent this spike protein from interacting with these ACE2 receptors. So if we learn to observe nature, if we learn to think about the foods that we eat, let's look at this. Carrots. Everybody knows carrots are good for the eyes, right? Beta carotene, vitamin A. This is very powerful medicine for the eyes. When you slice a carrot open, what does it look like? It looks like the eye, right? Walnuts. Walnuts look like brains. Walnuts are high in omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acid is very healthy for the brain. Tomatoes look like a heart. Tomatoes are high in a substance called lycopene, which is very healthy for the heart. Sweet potatoes look like the pancreas, and they're very powerful to help with glucose regulation. Grapes, a bunch of grapes, looks like little alveoli, the air sacs in the lungs, and they contain a substance called resveratrol, which helps prevent against lung cancer. Celery looks like bones and even contains the stringy things, you know, that everybody hates that get stuck in your teeth. But celery contains silica, which is very good to strengthen our bones. Ginger looks like the stomach, and we all know that ginger is good for nausea and vomiting. It's good to soothe the stomach. Banana, we heard about smiling and being happy this morning during our song. A banana is shaped like a smile. Well, bananas are high in serotonin, which is our happy hormone. So I think if we learn to observe the shapes of things in nature, I am learning that I can look at herbs. I can even look at mushrooms. There's a mushroom, if you slice a mushroom that's a typical shaped mushroom, if you slice it, it kind of looks like the ear. Mushrooms are high in vitamin D. Vitamin D is very healthy for the ears and the hearing mechanism. And so I really believe that nature will teach us, and I think that's probably kind of how the Indians learned. They learned to observe things in nature, and they understood that language. And I believe that if we ask the Lord, He will teach us how to use things from nature to our benefit. Yes, and the fig is another thing. The fig actually looks like a male scrotum, a testicle. Figs are very healthy. They help to regulate the sperm count and the fluidity of the semen. And so all of these things that we can learn from our foods and from nature and from herbs are very powerful tools that we can use when we face the spiky proteins that we face in this world. And even the avocado, it's kind of shaped like a lady's womb and it has a seed within. Avocados are good for a lady's uterus. And so we can learn so many things like this from nature. And so I've got to quit now. It's time for Sabbath school. And if you want these slides, just let me know after, and I'll turn it into a PDF and send it to you.